We've got some exceptional speakers for you this afternoon for this session. We've got a group of professionals here coming at this really important subject of healing after harm and the concept of just culture, which I'm sure, like me, you're wanting to know a lot more about, and in particular, how we can apply all the learning from what's been happening in this terrible time recently into going forwards and making ourselves a stronger and more sustainable group of individuals. I'm not going to spend much time in the way of preamble because we've got a busy hour ahead of us now. And in the usual fashion for a conference of this type, we're going to hear from the different speakers in turn. I'll let them introduce themselves because I think that makes it much more interesting in terms of the context of what's then to follow. And then we'll hopefully have time for some questions and discussion at the end of the session. And as is ever with these sessions, you're very welcome to put comments and questions into the chat box, and we'll do our best to address those at the end of the session as well. I would ask you, though, to just pause, obviously, and reflect upon the content of what's presented to you by our speakers. And I'm sure you'll find that the different perspectives which they bring will then amalgamate together towards the end of the session and give you a much fuller appreciation for the topic at hand. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Mr. Paul Stretton, who's going to be talking to us from his perspective around the importance of just culture. I'll head over to Paul now. Let him introduce himself and we'll take it from there. I hope you enjoy the session. It's going to be a really great hour. So I'll hand over to you now, Paul, and we're in your hands.
Thank you very much, Darren, and good afternoon, everybody. It's really nice to be able to work with you, and I'm very much looking forward to this session, including finding out more about what the work that Jane, Joe and Beatrice are doing in due course. I work as a head of research and innovation at a company called MedLed, so we work with a number of healthcare providers in and around human factors, patient safety culture, and particularly my interest is in and around, or one of my interests is around just culture, which, as Darren said, is an important aspect when we're looking at how we can learn from adverse events. From that, I've written a number of academic papers, and I've got a book coming out later this year that begins to bring a lot of these different concepts together. And yeah, I'm looking forward to being able to share with you some of my thoughts and the evolution of this idea of just culture across safety critical industries. I'm not a healthcare professional by trade, so I've worked across a number of safety critical industries from rail, civil engineering, process engineering, things like that. But more so in the last few years, working in and around healthcare, and found that it's really interesting that a lot of the pressures are very similar, even if the language is somewhat different. So first thing what I'd like to do, hopefully, is just begin to unpack a few of these concepts around why we need to learn from adverse events, and particularly where this idea or comes under this idea of just culture. And it may well be something that a term that we use a lot, and it's included in the new patient safety syllabus. But what is a just culture, and also what do we want to get from it? What I'd like to do firstly then, in terms of what do we get from this concept of a just culture, we could sit here probably for the rest of the day and begin to offer different outcomes and opportunities that a just culture may provide. But very simply, if I was to boil it down to some of the key ones, from a patient perspective, the patient safety should improve, and also the experience of patients and families affected or receiving the care should improve. From an internal perspective, I would expect to see the staff retention and staff morale also improving. So we've got internal and external benefits, and that's ultimately where we want to get to is trying to achieve as much of this as we possibly can. The idea of just culture has been around now for towards 25 years, and it was developed by a safety academic called James Reason. So it's not a healthcare specific concept. And in 1997, James Reason proposed this idea of a just culture. Over the time, some of the key messages that James Reason was trying to advocate have been lost in various arguments and to and fro about what a just culture is or may be. And so I think it's helpful for leaders to be able to start this journey of understanding how we can learn from adverse events from the very start. And James Reason argued that a just culture is about creating an atmosphere of trust. And primarily, if we work within the rules and commensurate with our training, we should be okay. However, if people deviate from our training and rules, then people need to be held accountable for it. This has born the decision trees, the algorithms and flowcharts, things that we'll be familiar with. NHS England has one, and indeed the patient safety syllabus that came out last week. This is the term or the concept of just culture that is embedded within it. Crucially, though, when we look at just culture, that was only the first part of the journey and the development that James Reason advocated. So he talked about the idea, firstly, of people being treated in a fair, consistent manner. So there's justice within the system. If there have been adverse events, that people will be treated fairly. As a result, then people may feel in a position to report concerns, near misses, and things like that to a greater extent. Because people feel then sufficiently supported to be able to report the concerns, that means that as an organisational level, we can begin to get this information and to learn from it. And this then will ultimately bring together this atmosphere of trust that James Reason advocated. So the just part is the first part of a bigger piece of work of cultural change and what we're trying to achieve. His argument is that if we got to that position, we would get those kind of outcomes that we talked about immediately. Now, that's the most widely used idea of just culture. If we go to aviation, if we go to process engineering, if we go to rail, this will be the definition, the concept of just culture that is primarily understood and used. Now, I've got absolutely no problem at all with this concept of just culture, but I think it's interesting for leaders potentially to have an awareness that actually the concept of just culture hasn't fixed around James Reason's approach. James Reason introduced it, but since then there have been some evolutions and developments of some different ideas. I would say within healthcare particularly, the work by Sidney Dekker on restorative just culture is probably one of the most important developments in recent years. Now, I'm really looking forward to hearing Beatrice and Joe, who are probably one of the world recognised advocates and proponents of restorative just culture within Mersey Care. And some of you may have seen the excellent DVD that generated, and be aware of their work. And I'll look forward to hearing more about that in due course. Central to Sidney Dekker's approach to just culture was about repairing trust and relationships damaged after an incident. So it's interesting that trust is still central to it, but it's a lot more of a human, interpersonal relation focus. So who's hurt? What do they need? How can we fix it? Can we forgive and move forward? So the restorative just culture is an alternative lens, if you like, of how we're going to get to those outcomes that we looked at. And this is where I suppose my interest particularly peaked in and around the healthcare and the role of just culture, because it's been policy within the NHS since 2001 that there would be a just culture. So Andy Milburn was the health secretary when this was first really introduced within the NHS. And it interested me that over 20 years, there's potentially been the transition hasn't been as great as the brilliance and the energy involved around it should be. It's not necessarily, though, a healthcare specific issue, because a lot of industries that I work with, a lot of companies I work with, have also found a certain degree of cultural inertia around trying to create this just culture, this atmosphere of trust that's central to improving our performance and our outcomes. As a result, I started doing more work, more research, and I wrote a paper that was published at the end of last year, arguing that there's maybe a different view for the modern complex workplace around this idea of just culture. So we're still trying to get to those kind of goals that we talked about, but we need to move away from understanding an organisation from 1997 and apply a modern lens. This led to a number of quite exciting opportunities over the winter. So the approach that I started to advocate has been accepted within some rail providers, international airlines, and also I got approached by NHS Education Scotland to do some work with them to develop the way they want to enable and support or NHS Trust to develop this idea of a just culture across Scotland. So we start with a fairly blank piece of paper where there's a lot of value within James Reason, there's a lot of value within Sidney Dekker, and some of the arguments that I started to offer as well. And we said that ultimately we want to create a culture that allows individuals and organisations to learn, heal, grow, and excel. And to do that, there are 6 principles within it. And so we've got the 6 principles there. And what I thought might be helpful to do, rather than just list them, is to see how all these different ideas map together with James Reason's and Sidney Decker's work. So we've got these 2 parallel views of just culture. At the top, we've got the kind of areas that Sidney Decker's restorative approach looks at, and at the bottom, we've got the sequential developments of culture that James Reason's argues. And so the 6 principles that I have been working with NHS Education Scotland were as follows. So learning over liability, and why we felt this was important was, whilst originally it was about treating people fairly, so liability is proportionately and reasonably applied, and that will lead to learning, our focus was that learning is paramount over anything else. So how can we improve? How can we get better? How can we understand what's going on? The other thing that we felt was very important was that anybody affected by any adverse events had the opportunity to be made whole again, whether that be individuals, the healthcare professionals involved with their care, families, whoever that may be, have the opportunity to be restored and healed, and certainly very much in line with that humanistic relational approach of Sidney Decker's. We also said, though, that in a highly regulated safety critical industry, the reality is, and you as leaders will be more than acutely aware of this, is there is accountability. So high performing environments have a healthy relationship with accountability. So how can we create a situation whereby people feel sufficiently confident to report issues, whether irrespective of the degree of harm that may have occurred? And so that feeds into the duty of candour, and also ideas around freedom to speak up and things like that. If that's what we want from people, though, I think there are some important aspects of the environment that we need to also factor into our approach. And the first one is the assumption of good intention. One of my initial concerns with the approach the classical approach by James Reason is the first question that typically gets asked is about deliberate harm. So we're basically asking people to say, we're going to process it, we're going to treat you fairly, but the first question is, are you a psychopath? And so actually, we've got to recognise and respect the people that are involved with the work and assume, until proven otherwise, that there's good intention on their behalf. Now, this follows more to an understanding of a systems-based approach and what's sometimes called localised rationality. So why did decisions make sense at the time? In the context that they were made and the pressure they were under, why did it make sense at the time? So we're going to take a view of the system. The error or the decision isn't the cause, it's a symptom of the conditions that were prevailing within the system at the time. And finally, and for me, this is one of the significant areas of the previous works that I think is an area that we could revise, is the idea of safety 1 and safety 2. So safety 1 is our classical view of safety. We learn from adverse events, and that's absolutely fine. That's absolutely important. And obviously that's the title of our session today. Moving forward, and again, the patient safety syllabus recognises both the systems thinking and safety 2 approach within that, is the work from Eric Holnagel that says that we need to, if we're going to improve, to create the optimal environments, we can learn from adverse events, but we can learn from everyday work, and we can learn from excellence as well. So it's hard for me to be persuaded by an argument that we have an approach that is just, that is fair, that creates an atmosphere of trust, if we ignore 95% of our work and we only kick into gear and we react when there is an adverse event. And so we wanted to develop an approach that could learn from adverse events, but we could also be applied more consistently throughout the organisation, so that we did ultimately get to that sense of an atmosphere of trust. Now, that's quite a lot of information to share with you in 10 minutes, and it was a very quick whistle-stop tour, but hopefully we've been able to unpack some of the concepts that Jane, Beatrice and Joe will go into in more detail in a more applied manner going forwards. I suppose for me, the idea that just culture isn't a fixed principle, it isn't a fixed definition, is quite empowering for a leader. So it enables us to start looking more specifically at organisations. What is it that we want to achieve? What is the culture and the environment that we want to create? And how can we do that? And I saw Suzette Woodward's summary slide earlier, and I was interested that actually Suzette's summary slide says where we want to be, or considerations for leaders, had quite a lot of overlap and similarity with the 6 points that we've been working in Scotland. So hopefully, if Suzette Woodward agrees, there's a reasonable amount of validity within them. So there we go. So thank you very much. I will hand over to Jane and find out now how some of these broader areas around just culture can start understanding how we can get some value and create some change. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And just before Jane comes in, just to say, Paul, thanks ever so much for that contribution. Such a huge amount of information you've shared with us there in such a short space of time. I think it just underlines the importance and power of this work. And I know that Jane will take the conversation and the story further on now, but just to say thank you, Paul, thus far for your contribution there. We're coming slightly down the country now, crossing to God's own country in Yorkshire with Jane, who has a portfolio draped in healthcare quality and safety. And I know this is going to be a fabulous additional session here from Jane. So over to you now, Jane. Thank you. We're in your hands.
Sorry. Thanks, Darren. Thanks, Paul. It was really interesting to hear your thoughts on the sort of evolution of just culture as a principles and a concept. And I learned something. That was great. Thank you very much. And hopefully what I'm going to talk about today is going to really complement that. And I think one of the things, one of the criticisms of just culture in recent years has been that whilst it's a laudable attempt to create a sort of more equitable, fair, even blame-free system, actually there has been criticism that one of the key stakeholders has been left out of that conversation. And certainly some views on just culture, or certainly some definitions of just culture, have actually not really focused on patients and families too. So I think this is something which is emerging more recently as a key area of interest in order to think more broadly about what just culture is. So I'm Jane O Hara. I am a professor of healthcare quality and safety based at the University of Leeds. I'm also deputy director of the Yorkshire Quality and Safety Research Group, which is based, as Darren says, in God's own county. What I'd like to talk to you about today really is sort of shaped around some work that we're heavily involved in as we speak, really. We are halfway through a large project, and I'll go on to talk about the specifics in a moment. But really, this project is aiming to understand how we might better involve patients and families in serious incident investigations. And our journey from sort of thinking that was primarily about improving learning, but actually how we've come to understand that it also needs to improve the restoration of all stakeholders following an adverse event. So I'm just trying to get used to the internet clicker on my phone, which keeps going off. Okay, so involving patients and families in serious incident investigations is not a new concept. It has been enshrined in various policies and legal frameworks. So this is the Serious Incident Framework, which is the current policy framework set down by NHS England. I think the last version of that was in 2015, and I know that they're working on a new one and that patient and family involvement is in them, but this is the current process. We also have a professional duty of candour, which was introduced between 2014 and 2015, which requires organisations and individuals to share information about things that have gone wrong in care once they meet a certain threshold. So it's there in policy. We know that we should do it, but actually there was just ahead of putting in the application for this programme of work, we started thinking about, okay, well, to what extent are patients and families involved in investigations? And this really helpful document from the CQC, which was in 2016, took a look at the reports from serious incident investigations from around the country, and they found very little evidence, actually, of routinely including patients and families in serious incident investigations. So as we put in the bid, we knew from our team experience of working with patients and families to improve healthcare safety, and also the evidence that was there from these sorts of reports. We knew that patients and families were not necessarily routinely involved in investigations, but we also knew that through policy, from a policy perspective, from a leader's perspective, if you like, the organisational learning and creating what is termed as a just culture in these policy frameworks, that this is a key kind of aim of investigations, policies and processes. So we could conclude really that not involving patients and families was missing a really key perspective in understanding what went wrong when something goes wrong in hospitals. So our hypothesis, if you like, was that if we can better involve patients and families, if we can support organisations to do that, but actually we should be able to improve the learning that arises from these investigations. So we were very lucky to get a nice amount of money from the National Institute of Health Research. We awarded the funds in mid-2019. And the aim of the project that we call the Fireside Project, so that's involving patients and families in serious incident investigations. The aim of it is to develop and test new processes and guidance to support the better involvement of patients and families in serious incident investigations. And we're aware that whilst there may be commonalities about the ways that we might do this, there also might be slight differences in the way that these things might be supported better across different healthcare settings, and particularly between mental health settings and acute care settings, but also at the level of national investigations. So we are working with the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch as one of our key partners in this work. So what have we done so far? Well, we took a range of policies selected at random from across NHS, the NHS in England, from both acute care and mental health. We also, those policies were policies for the serious investigation policies from organisations, from healthcare organisations. We also reviewed all the empirical work, published scientific work that was out there about the experience of patients and families who are involved in serious incident investigations. And we interviewed a lot of people. So we interviewed, obviously, patients and families who've been through investigations, but also we interviewed investigators themselves, people who are doing this in hospitals and people who might not necessarily see themselves as safety people. And we also interviewed staff who'd been through investigations themselves about their views of that experience, but also about the possibilities for involving patients and families and some of the issues that we'll begin to unpick as we go through today's session. And we brought all of that data together and we put it into our academic mixer, if you like, and we synthesized it, and we came up with two key outcomes at this point in the program. We're about halfway through this program. We wanted to come up with a set of common principles which lay the foundations for co-designing better ways to do this, and I'll talk about those common principles in a moment. But we also came up with a sort of broad term for the approach that we're trying to take, and I'll really explain those two things in more detail now, hopefully, if it works. Sorry, could you move that on for me, Paddy? Thank you. So the common principles, these are things which we've drawn from this, across this range of bits of information, of data that we've gathered. And it's 10 kind of key statements of intent. It's 10 things that we think should be evident in our new processes for involving patients and families. And the reason I've got draft written across in big letters is not academic preciousness in any way. It's merely because actually this is a working draft, essentially. This is going to be changed, going to be iterated by working with our co-design community. So this is our best guess at the moment about the final set of principles that we might use. And there are obvious ones in there that you might expect, like make apologies meaningful, listening, providing basic information, although that seems like it should be a given, but it's often not. But there are some really interesting ones in there as well, and ones I think it's really important for leaders of organisations to think through about some of the practicalities of thinking about how we might achieve these. So things like accepting subjectivity. I think sometimes, particularly in safety, we've been guilty of assuming that we are looking for truth, and we're not looking for truth. Truth doesn't exist in a sense. It is about what we can understand from a situation, given the people that we speak to, the documents that we have, and we come up with the best version of events that we can possibly manage. And I think sometimes that gets lost, and patients and families can feel very sidelined because their views on what's happened often aren't given credence. So as well as that set of common principles, we also came to thinking that, like Paul says, how people experience investigations, it's complex, it's relational, and that whilst adverse events happen in complex systems, and healthcare is the most complex of kind of safety systems, if you like, that those events happen to people, and they happen to individuals within systems. And so whilst as an organisation, we might say we want to get the most out of learning from these events, and that patients and families therefore clearly have valuable insights to improve our efforts for organisational learning and to try and reduce the likelihood of further recurrence. They also have needs. Patients and families and staff will have needs that arise following an incident and an event. And actually, they will have needs not just due to the event, but actually what we found through working with a range of patients and families and staff that this has happened to, is that actually the ways in which we investigate can often cause more problems in some ways than the actual incident itself. And we're kind of terming that as compounded harm. So our approach is one that we're terming restorative learning, and that is very kind of broadly defined as that we need to respond to and we need to investigate incident in ways that support the healing for people that are involved, the restoration of people involved, as well as the learning, and that has to happen for all stakeholders involved. So we're in the middle of this process. We are moving rapidly towards through a co-design process. So we've been doing all sorts of interesting stuff. We're running the co-design virtually, but we are also sending out packs to people to try and get them engaged with the evidence and so on and so forth. I'm very happy to talk to people about that if they're interested. But essentially, we're in the middle of a co-design process, and eventually, once we've got draft set of guidance, we will then also move into a testing phase later this year, where we will look to see if the developed guidance makes any difference. But what now? So in the meantime, I just wanted to leave with you a few thoughts, really, because as leaders of organisations or senior people in organisations, there are arising from our work a real sense that there are a number of ambiguities and a number of tensions that need to be articulated and need to potentially be explored and not necessarily resolved, but certainly understood when it comes to what a just culture might mean for different stakeholders in the organisation. So even down to things like, what is an incident? What should be investigated? Now, going forward with the Patient Safety Incident Response Framework, there will be potentially much more latitude in the decisions about what incidents should be investigated. And they may be, you might, if you have organisational learning at the forefront, you might think, well, it's ones with the potential for learning. But actually, patients and families might then say, well, I want closure, I want information about my experience, about what happened to me. I need to understand what's happened to me in order to restore, to be part of my restorative process. Similarly, what about blame? So when you're implementing or you're trying to improve, and head towards a just culture, You don't want your staff to feel that they're scared or feel that they might be blamed for something. But actually, there is, whilst patients and families often say that they don't want to blame individuals, they do want someone or something to be accountable for what's happened to them, their individual experience. And I think that this is really at the nub of some of these ambiguities and these tensions. But actually, in the rush, I think, to reduce the need to blame individuals, we have made the understanding of adverse events about systems. We have made it about different things, all compacting and all coming together to result in adverse events. And that's all very laudable, and I can understand that. But even when error is multifactorial, these things are happening between people. And so whilst the organisation, because they don't want to blame individuals, might shy away from reconciliation, of physical reconciliation between individuals, patients and families, and in fact staff themselves, might want to meet as individuals within this complex system to understand what's happened and to seek some sort of reconciliation. So I hope I've gone some way to explaining a little bit about what we're doing, and I hope that that makes sense in the context of the session. But my final thoughts then, obviously, when things go wrong, we need to support all stakeholders, not just to improve the organisational learning, but also to attend to their needs that arise following the event. And we are co-designing at the moment tools and practical guidance that will work across different settings, hopefully. And they will be publicly available at some point in the future once we've gone through the testing phase. But in the meantime, what I think it's really important for organisations and for leaders to do is to think about, not just pay lip service to Just Culture, but actually think about, okay, so if I'm implementing a Just Culture, what does this mean in terms of some of these tensions and ambiguities, and what might we do about those things? So,
thank you.
So I'll just leave you with that, a little shout out from my team. And if anybody's interested in the work going forward, this is our Twitter account. Thank you, Darren.
Perfect. Thank you, Jane, so much. I would imagine everyone will be logging onto Jane's Twitter account now and signing up to be part of that excellent endeavour. So stand by for the tsunami there, Jane, of interest. Hopefully so. Cross fingers. But seriously, a superb contribution there, Jane. Thank you. You can see already, I think, how the narrative started from Paul, who's introduced the earlier work on Just Culture, and Jane's taken it to a different place there in terms of the current work that's going on right now. So thank you, Jane. We'll come back, I'm sure, to many elements of what you've talked about there with Paul in the discussion at the end. We're going to hand out, we're going now over the Pennines, and we're coming into Merseyside. We've got Mersey Care contributions now from Beatrice and Joe, who are with us. And a different perspective again here around learning from adverse events. This is, as you can see, a double-hander between Beatrice and Joe. Beatrice is going to kick us off. So we're in your hands, Beatrice, and look forward to your session. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. And the theme of running through from Paul and Jane and to how in Mersey Care it's being implemented is an absolutely logical set of presentations. I'm not going to say a great deal because I think that what the audience on the whole are going to want to hear is from Joe around the implementation in operational terms. But what I do want to say as chair of the trust, and then follow up perhaps with questions after, is the, first of all, my own background is really interesting in this context because I'm an ergonomist, and that is actually about human factors and how to design systems and structures to meet the needs of recipients. And the point I want to start with is that when other chair colleagues talk to me about what are you doing in Mersey Care and how do we do it, the first thing is they don't understand is it takes time. And we started as a board discussing this really seriously about 2015. And we're still learning and going through it, as you will hear from Joe. So that the two factors that I do want to refer to are the culture of the organization in the first place, as understanding that this is fundamentally important to take account of at the board so that the whole board understand where the next step might be if they want to take it. And that is very much in our case based on the fact that as a board, we are an integrated board, we have an awful lot of trust across us and a lot of listening and learning and development together already. So that trusted environment where we can start to understand this might be a really risky thing that we're going to be undertaking. Is it worth doing? How do we test it? What do we know? What don't we know? Where do we feel that we need to run it through our governance structures so that we can keep a line of sight, is the starting point. At that stage, I'll say, and not a huge expectation of where it might take us. And I couldn't have done this, and working with Joe and across the board, in even taking that first step, if as a board, our values were absolutely about openness, transparency, and understanding how important it is to take and work with our own service users and community in what we're doing. So that when I'm looking at where we've got to, it almost feels like a natural progression. But I'm actually quite surprised to think we started this in 2015, and it's still a learning journey for us. So at that point, it's not about a tick box, it's not a quick fix, but it's got to be grounded in the values of the organisation. I don't want to say any more about that at this stage, unless because I want Joe to have the time that he needs for his own presentation of it, but I'm really happy to take further questions around the board perspective, the non-execs, and the development through that aspect of it through questions later. So could I just hand straight over to Joe?
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Can I just ask Glasgow's colleagues, I can't see the presentation, so I don't quite know what slide people are looking at right now. Is there a way I can see the presentation? Okay, I'll, in the interest of time.
Hi, Joe. It's Paddy,
Hello.
the technician. You should be able to see the slideshow. I'm sorry, I have no idea why you can't see it.
No,
it's being shared through Zoom.
Okay, so could I ask you to move the slides for me then?
Yes, sure. You just say next slide. I'll move it for you.
If you could go to the slide starting, I think it's the third slide in.
Okay.
And it says Mersey Care's journey. Is that right?
Yep, you're
okay.
Good.
So thanks very much. I'll prompt you then, Paddy. Thank you. So in the context of what Beatrice has said, it's been really, really interesting to listen to Paul and Jane's contributions. So much of the thinking that I sort of recognise. The one thing that we have been doing is really trying to take the concept of just culture, and we adhere pretty strongly to the Sidney Dekker model of restorative practice, and really work out what does it mean, or what does it take to begin to take that concept and put it into a set of practices. So this slide here is a demonstration just of the fact that the organization itself since 2015 has been a very significant growth and development journey. So at the end of this month, Mersey Care will undertake its fourth acquisition, which by June 1st will have trebled the size of the organization since 2015. And the point about showing this slide is that, generally speaking, what the research and literature shows around major growth and acquisitions like this is that staff satisfaction and often safety metrics tend to plummet during this sort of large-scale change phase between organizations. And actually, what we've observed is an increase in engagement in staff satisfaction, in reporting of safety metrics, and so on. And if I go to the next slide, please, Paddy, there's a couple of big things that have mattered to us in the process. So this slide shows the board's focus, not just on organizational performance, which tends to be the thing we we do most often in NHS terms, but actually to have thought about how we deliver that performance through a very strong focus on organisational health. This is the Mckinsey Framework. We didn't invent it. There's nothing, well, we don't claim that, but what we have done is use these features pretty much centrally to develop our strategy, develop our thinking, and place our the work we do in the organisation inside some, or to some extent all of these categories, and certainly some that have focused on direction, leadership, and particularly on 3, 4, and 7, on culture, climate, accountability, and on motivation. So next slide, please, is an important second phase of what has happened in this organization. So while we have been focusing on delivering some really significant system level and organizational change, we did encounter a period when we had 3 very significant sets of safety incidences in the organization, which ran contrary in a sense to the sort of safety concepts that we were developing in Mersey Care at the time. So we took a big step back and we asked 400 senior clinicians in the organization what it felt like when something goes wrong in the event of a major incident, and when the trust started that process of investigating an SI. And this was work we invited an independent group to come in and do. It was done over a reasonably long period of time. It was kept very confidential. But the donut here was a sort of major shock for us. 50% of our senior clinicians when asked, replied, fear, blame, shame, consequence, dismissal was what they felt when an investigation was going on. And you can see that the trust itself was, our systems were characterized by lack of support and a lack of trust, and the organization itself was described as adversarial. And then really, really critically, so much feedback that there was a lack of feedback, that we really weren't closing the loop on learning, which we had, thought we had done a great deal of work on. So in short, the organization, the words people often use was the organization felt retributive in its approach. And quite clearly, we were not in that virtuous cycle of incident, investigation, learning, close down frequency of future incidents and so on. And instead, we were sort of in a vicious cycle where staff most frequently associated a blame culture with what we were trying to do. Big shock for the board, for Beatrice and myself and everybody else, because we certainly as a board didn't set out to create a culture like that. But for us, the major lesson was work as we imagined it as a board was very much different to work as how it's done. And that became a very significant learning point for us. Next slide, please. So like many organizations, we tried to set out to work out what was going on and how we could move to a better place. So we thought about how do we move away from retribution, but to what exactly, we didn't entirely know. It was at a time then we quite fortuitously made contact with Sidney Decker, who talked to us about just culture, a restorative just culture. And we were excited by the prospect. We could see in the same benefits, potential benefits, that Paul and Jane have both outlined today. But I suppose the difference for us was we really felt the pressure to ask the question. It's really, really interesting, just restorative practice, but how the heck do you do it? What does it mean in practice? Because almost in this world, I think the worst thing we can do is keep hypothesizing about things and continuing to split hairs and try and understand fine detail. When in reality, what we wanted to do was do something that moved us in generally the right direction. So in short, in a retributive system, the instinct is to ask which rule is broken, who did it, really important, who did it, how bad is the breach, and in particular, what should the consequences be? And generally speaking, the response in a retributive system is to work out how to write more rules, because the rules we written in the first instance weren't good enough. So how do we write more rules? And everything we discovered in our now 6-year journey has told us that a retributive approach is counterproductive. It still predominates in many parts of our NHS, but it stops learning. It lacks humanity, compassion, forgiveness. The point about healing. We tend to meet more harm with harm. We discovered the processes we were running in an attempt to understand and improve actually damaged our staff in the process. And of course, what goes is trust. And in restoration, we ask who's hurt, what are their needs, whose obligation is it to meet those needs, and how do we involve the community? That may be the community in the way that Jane has quite rightly stated. For us, most of the time, it has involved our community of practitioners, because the principle has been if we can get that to a good place, then when we involve our wider community, we do so from a very strong and trusting base internally. And the goals of restoration are about moral engagement, emotional healing, reintegration of practitioners. We lose so many people during investigations because of long periods of removal from the workplace and so on. It's really critical for it to be the core, we think, of our organizational learning. And of course, the core objective is prevention. And in this system, accountability, as we work it, is prospective. It's about how you can learn and how you can make an incident and what happened a learning process, so that in a prospective view of where we go, we absolutely reduce the risk of recurrence. It's not a retrospective, and we find confirmationally biased, often subjective view of the world. Well, we've discovered where we've looked at retributive systems, the question very quickly moves to who did what, and as I said, how bad is the breach of the rule? In a restorative system, we ask what, how, and when. So much more open. Next slide, please. And then if you could put there's a lot of dots between these two slides and a lot of time. But where we are now, where we've landed on largely in Mersey Care, is the building of psychological safety into all of our teams. So describing our teams really well. And then first of all, setting the stage. So frame the work of the team, emphasize the shared beliefs and values, a strong belief in openness and transparency. And that, of course, the team leader sets the tone in terms of psychological safety. To destigmatize failure, so state openly that failure is something that will happen. Emphasize the purpose of the team, why it matters, what's at stake. And of course, to completely begin to then reframe language as we go. Language itself can be quite harming in this respect. To demonstrate fallibility and humility is a really important element of what we are trying to achieve in psychologically safe teams. It's all right not to know the answer, and that doesn't matter which team you're in. If you're on a frontline team doing the same thing every day, or if you're in the chief executive's team, you don't have to know all the answers. Actively invite others to participate, so openly recognize that no one person is right and somebody else's view is wrong. So very much to Jane's view, if you think you can get at the truth, well, good luck. But what you can do is have a strong sense of inclusive dialogue, and of course, active listening and questioning. And then to respond productively. So to use all of our schemes to encourage our system to move to the necessity of learning from failures in that safety one way that Paul has talked about, but really to begin to shift ourselves to begin to think about routine work and the many, many really positive things that happen every day, and to begin to reinforce those. So in our building team safety piece, we're very clear that we want to halt judgments and instead ask why people behave in the way they do. That proactive listening to understand why people behave as they do. To recognize explicitly and openly at every layer of our organization that staff are not the problem. Staff are actually the solution to move in towards a safer culture. And really critically, and we experienced this through many major incidents where so for example around suicides in our care, where transparency and openness weren't what they could be. And of course, transparency and openness won't be what it could be if we live in a retributive world. The whole process of retribution suppresses transparency and openness, and transparency and openness is absolutely the key. They're the allies, not the enemies of restoration. Restoration for sort of second victims in the terms of staff and so on, but also in terms of the first victim group, those who die, those who are harmed, and those who are bereaved. So all very interesting so far. So our staff ask us, our staff side, our union said to us, restorative just practice, fantastic. We love the idea. We're not sure we believe you, but we love the idea. But if you could reduce the level of suspension and disciplinary activity in the organization, if you actually demonstrated that you're interested not in the process of simply pushing people through the pipeline to make sure that we officially close an investigation in the right way, and we can demonstrate that people have been held to account. But if you instead reduce the frequency of those sorts of issues and engage in a much more human learning conversation much earlier on, then we will believe that this process has got legs. So if you go to the next slide, labeled investigations and suspensions, you can see our progress between 2016 when we started counting and last year. And you see in solid blue bars investigations, and in the red line the number of suspensions in the organization. So headlines are, during this period, while we developed the practice of restorative just culture, investigations decreased by 79%, and suspensions decreased by 86%. Do things still happen in the organization? Of course they still happen in the organization. You know, all of the natural behaviors of big complex organizations still applies. But what we have done is move early, talk, understand, and learn rapidly, and that has knocked on into a significant reduction, as you can see, in ER activity. And at the same time, the trust has increased its workforce, as I showed in that first slide, by 135%. The next slide marked respect and civility impact. We then moved from the sort of core practice of what we were doing into thinking about the impact of respect and civility. There's been lots written about this, but we took it very seriously, and we ran a very significant campaign, and we're still running it, I Will Speak Up, which encourages bystanders to feel supported to speak up if they see poor behavior, based on the old adage that the culture of the organization is entirely conditioned by the behaviors that everybody's prepared to walk past. And you can see that this is for the 2019-20 year. So we ranked nationally second in the country on the score. Last time you experienced harassment, bullying and abuse, did your colleague report it? The previous year, we were first in the country. So that's a really sort of significant, to me anyway, two sets of figures that describe how you can take this and turn it into action. Would I feel secure raising concerns about unsafe clinical practice? This isn't a slide, I forgot to put it in, but if you look at the figures for that question across the National Staff Survey from 2016 through to 2020, you can see a 10% rise in staff responding positively to that, which ranks us last year 19 out of 220 trusts in the country against that particular measure. So it was really not to say that we don't have work to do. We have lots and lots of work to do in the organisation. But I thought it was interesting that I think it might have been Paul who said we would expect to see some changes in these sorts of metrics in an organisation if we were really engaging in the restorative just practice or the just culture piece in a pretty earnest way. So I think that story encapsulates an awful lot of work, an awful lot of practices, which we don't have time to go into. But I thought I'd talk about those three sets of outcomes because it feels like, generally speaking, in our organisation now, we have a very different focus on understanding how to learn, in the Safety 1 context and now growingly in the Safety 2 context. And our next phase of the journey is to do exactly as Jane suggested, which is we'll now move to think about restoration on a much broader context now, including those harmed in our care. So Beatrice, I'll let you have the last remark if that's okay.
Thanks. And you can see why I wanted to give all the time over to Joe, because through this commentary, you'll see that none of this would have been achievable if it wasn't supported and run through the board. And over that period of time, the only thing I'd like to add is we've also adjusted our governance approach to taking account of how we measure and evaluate how the pace of this is working and where some of the risk may shift and change, especially as we're now moving into the acquisition of yet another trust, so that we will now be integrating a whole set, I think 4,000 staff who know about this by and large, have done some work across the organizations, but we will be building on again. So thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Beatrice, and thank you very much indeed, Joe. That was a great example of putting the evidence into action, putting the theory into practice there. Call it what you will. And I think at the start of this hour, I suggested to you that we would have a rich series of presentations with draped in real life examples of work that was going on or was in train. And I think that has been delivered in spades, such that we have relatively little time for discussion. With that in mind, I just wanted to open the discussion between the panelists, just with a proposition. Perhaps Paul, because you've been listening to the other presentations there, and all of us will know who are in this session as delegates or presenters that the restorative culture is hard won in the NHS, isn't it? And there's been such a history of retribution and the blame culture has been very pervasive. I wonder, Paul, what are your reflections on why that is the case and why a just culture has been such a hard-won prize in the NHS? What do you think lies behind the difficulties we've had in getting to even where we are, Paul?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. Secondly, I'm not convinced that it may be an idea whose time's come now. But the provision, but I think the work that Joe and Beatrice are doing at Mersey Care is incredible and inspirational, but it's also in the minority, and hopefully we can make that more normal. Like I say, when I said earlier that it's not just purely healthcare related, actually people struggle with a just culture. People's instinct is to blame. People's instinct is to hold people's feet to the fire. And also I was interested when Jane said about actually one of the patients, the patient's needs may be that they want to hold someone accountable. And how does that look like and how does that feel like? I think it is a particular aspect of healthcare. And when we talk about understanding the complexity of healthcare, I think the role of patients is something that is something that's really, really important, rather than importing a concept of just culture from aviation or heavy engineering. Actually starting, and it's interesting that both Joe and Jane talked about that individualized iterative approach. So it's about understanding where, as an organization, people are at, where do they want to get to, and then that journey that I think Joe beautifully explained. It isn't going to be quick. It's not a communication piece. It's not a flow chart on the wall. Don't get succumbed into buying a checklist or anything like that. Actually, it's about the deep conversations about where are we, listening. And I think both Joe and Jane again talks a lot about listening, respect, the power of the apologies, psychological safety. So there are common themes that I'm sure we'll run through other sessions as well. And it's then about, as leaders, how can we create that environment that becomes more normal and acceptable, and initiate that change and continue it.
Indeed. So thanks, Paul. That's spot on, isn't it, in relation to the position from where we've come. I wonder, Jane, if I was to suggest to you that obviously a just culture would be part of what we'd expect for a safety culture, and if the hypothesis was that you could have a safety culture without a just culture, would that be tenable, or do you think the two are? Is one a necessity of the other?
It's a really interesting question. I think, and I'm sure Paul will have a view on this anyway, I think you can potentially have a safety culture without a just culture. And I think largely that's what we've been trying to do over recent years. We've seen safety, as you say, Joe, as a organisational performance issue. We've been measuring things like incidents, number of incidents, whether they go up or they go down. We've been measuring things like length of stay. We measure all kinds of different things. But actually, we're not really we don't measure anything that indicates to the extent to which people feel safe, or to which people are able to report and to learn. And I think the really key thing that's come out from this session for me is how hard, how complex it is, and how much effort, I think, as a system we need to go to create that safety where you can be vulnerable as both a staff member and a patient, and that vulnerability and that coming together to say, I am vulnerable, I'm a human in this system and I have needs, that we have the resource, we have the time, and that we are valuing that activity, actually, not just because it meets a particular need and we need to get through these performance measures and we need to measure different metrics and things, but actually because it's the right thing to do. And it's the right thing to do partly because of all the things that Joe said. It supports our staff, it creates better care potentially, all of these things. I think over time we'll begin to see these things much more. But so I think in the future, a positive safety culture is going to be a just culture. That would be my view.
Thanks, Jane. That all makes sense, and thank you for that contribution there. I'll tell you what is unjust is that this session has come to an end, and we could be talking around all this topic for another hour to come, which is really frustrating, but I think just underlines how important and how significant this work is, and how much more there is to go. It goes without saying, whatever euphemism you choose, we're on a journey here, and I very much anticipate that we will come back to this subject again and again, and we should do. Is my reflection, because it's so important. It's so vital to making sure that our patients are safely cared for. But I'm really sorry to say our session time has come to an end. It only remains for me to thank Paul, Jane, Beatrice and Joe for their contributions today, and all of you for making the time to log into this session, which I hope has been of value. And stay safe, look after yourselves, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks for now. Take care.